Hey everyone, it's Horror Free for All, and I hope you're doing well today. So I have here a video duology that I've decided to make, and it all started around this one question. And this question stems from my love of horror anthology and my love of horror anthology comics at the same time, and knowing the history behind horror anthology comic publication and how the big two, Marvel and DC, have had a history with this traditional style of storytelling in comics that both seem to have completely abandoned in modern times in favor of superhero stories, which is understandable to a degree. I can't help but ask myself, why hasn't Marvel and DC attempted to make a horror anthology movie based around stories that they released themselves in their own perspective publications? So, this first video I decided would be centered around that question, but more focused on Marvel Comics. Now, when people think of Marvel horror anthology comics, most, if not all of them, came out in the 1950s. um, and then they kind of disappeared for a long time until the Bronze Age in the 1970s, where they started coming out again in reprints with a handful of some new stories and adaptations of classic stories from people like Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert Bloch, etc., etc. And then once that ended, Marvel's pretty much abandoned the idea of making horror anthology comic stories anymore. And they've kind of become relics of the past. I remember a few years ago, though, maybe like in 2019, about 7 years ago, there was like an 80th anniversary where Marvel decided to put out one shots of old titles that they used to have, like Journey into Unknown Worlds and Crypt of Shadows. And they had creators that were, I guess, contracted at the time, contribute brand new stories for these one shots. And it brought a lot of hope to fans because, like myself, I bought all the issues and I even bought the trade after, and I read them all and really enjoyed them. And it made me just kind of sad that the companies that most people go to comic shops for, like Marvel and DC, don't offer stuff like this anymore for the masses. And it's a shame, but I get it on one hand how Marvel is by this point known as the MCU slash Disney company that pumps out superhero stuff. Granted, if you look on Disney Plus, there is a few things on there that do pay homage and do try to attempt at Marvel's horror side. However, it's mostly centered around horror hero characters or reoccurring characters that Marvel's had in their ranks for many years, at least since the 1970s. And there's even some characters that have been going around in this horror space within the publication since the 1950s when they were pumping out these horror comics. So I get why they tend to focus on that because superheroes make billions of dollars at the box office, and maybe them wasting their time with a relatively lower budget film that they don't know people would care about inherently could be a gamble. But I think that in this day and age, especially at this point of the MCU, I think it would actually be refreshing to see Marvel take a chance on going back to their catalog, picking out some stories that they think would be worthy of making a traditional horror anthology film akin to something like Creepshow. And if it was even stylized like that, that's even better because Marvel has that Disney budget. And hopefully they could use that money to good work to make the editing pop. I think horror fans, especially if Marvel took a chance on it and actually made it a rated R movie, might flock to it, and it could become a cult classic or even a fan favorite anthology movie, akin to something like Creepshow, which came out in the 1980s, that captured a cultural zeitgeist and a cult following in its own right. But the reason why people resonate with that movie so much is because it captures what it's like to read a comic book. It captures what it's like to experience the average story, whether you're reading an EC comic or a Bronze Age DC comic, or in this case, mostly 1950s or maybe some early Bronze Age Marvel comic stories. And I think Marvel and DC should at least attempt it one time. I've felt like this for a while, and I think the experiment would be worth it if maybe, just maybe, they had people like myself who, at this point, and I'm being upfront and honest, I've experienced 98% of all available Marvel anthology comic stories in regards to horror and science fiction. I've read them all. And I can tell you this, Marvel's selection at, I guess, theatrical, movie-worthy stories is very, 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 very slim. And I would dare say that if we're comparing like Marvel versus DC in this situation, DC was well known, I guess more so after the hokey science fiction and weird fiction stuff they were putting out in the 50s, for their horror was in the Bronze Age in the 70s. I would dare say that DC's Bronze Age in the 70s beats out anything, whether we're talking pre-code or post-code Atomic Age, that Marvel was putting out. And that's saying something, because Marvel has this reputation with horror anthology stuff from back in the day being very kid-friendly, very tame, kind of crypt / EC Comics knockoff-esque. There are some stories that I think people will kind of hold in high regard that I just don't agree with, that I've seen on the internet. But I will say that they're mostly entertaining. They're mostly harmless fun. A lot of the problems with these stories stem down to back in the day, they wouldn't mind putting out 4-pagers, which if you compare it to something like modern comics coming out today like Creepshow, where the average story is getting at least 10 pages, so to speak, full of panels, and you only get 4 pages in these older ones. Truncation and stories kind of feeling hollow, or they veer in random directions for the sake of having a twist in it, is a common thing. So when you compare that to stuff they were even putting out in the 70s, which were mostly just reprints, I would say maybe 90% of the stuff they were putting out in the 70s were reprints of these old 50s stories. And if it wasn't that, they were just adapting classic stories for the most part. And there was maybe a handful of stories that were coming out that were fresh at the time. But most of them, if they weren't coming out in these floppies that people call them now, were coming out in these magazines that Marvel would do that were genuine competitors to stuff like Warren magazines of titles like Vampirella, Creepy, Eerie. So I'm talking all across it all. Okay, I've read them, basically all of them. The only ones I haven't touched really are some of the magazines, even though I've read through, I think, 2 runs of them at this point. That's pretty much the last unvetted territory for me, and then I've experienced everything that Marvel has to offer when it comes to horror anthology at this point. So I would consider myself a well-versed fan. I would consider myself very impassioned, and I will say this up front, I put a lot of thought into this, okay? So first and foremost, I guess we'll get into the hypothetical movie here, right? So as a fan, you know, I kind of think of some ideas of what would be a cool thing to bring to the discussion here, to the question, right? Why haven't they? Well, they have been harping on superheroes making billions of dollars. They're probably not paying too much attention to it. But let's say in the hypothetical, they find this video, or maybe somebody in the round table of executives decide to look into this idea. Where should they look first? Well, the first thing they should look at is the title, right? The title. A lot of these titles that were birthed went on to become synonymous with superhero characters. Tales of Suspense became synonymous with Iron Man. Journey into Mystery became synonymous with Thor. Marvel Tales, for years, was that weird fiction / horror title. And later, when it got revived, it became a reprint title mainly for Spider-Man. The list goes on. So if you're going to make a horror anthology movie based around Marvel Comics, I feel like you should go back to the 50s and look into titles that were made specifically for that market in mind, that have never been brought back, either into the reprint era that they had in the Bronze Age, or weren't brought back in the sense of it being tied to superheroes. And there's a handful of titles that are in there, but the one title that sticks out in my head every time I think about it, because when I think about Atomic Age Marvel Comics, it's usually this title and Journey into Mystery that are the two most popular ones. And the title in question is Adventures into Terror. Adventures into Terror was a relatively short-lived series. I think it ran for maybe like 20 or 30 or so issues, maybe pushing 40 from memory. And a lot of fans seem to think that this is basically the sweet spot that Marvel was in during that time. Now, I should say this. Each title, kind of like their EC Comics competitors of the time, had a different style and a different flavor. Marvel, around this time, was doing kind of a grab bag of things. They were doing stories that infamously now have been speculated that influence Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. And I'm being upfront and honest about that. And people have literally put pen to paper and written blogs about certain Marvel comic stories that came out years before the Twilight Zone episode, and how they see the parallels to the Twilight Zone episode that took the concept from the comic, right? So they write Twilight Zone-esque stories. They're known for doing a lot of weird, silly, kind of gaff humor kind of tales where there's a lot of just corny punchlines and silly concepts that make no sense and are kind of cringe. Then you have your monster schlock stuff. There is some kaiju monster stuff in the mix if we're talking Jack Kirby. There's some also grounded stuff like swamp monsters and, creature feature type of stuff kind of thrown in there. You have your knockoff tame versions of EC Comics stories, which are admittedly kind of violent, even for Marvel standards back in the day, for them at least, where you have morality tales in play about be careful what you wish for, asshole come up and stuff like that. And the list goes on. And then maybe you have some stories here and there that surprisingly feel like Creepshow, where it's schlocky for the sake of being schlocky and kind of out there, but there's some subtext and layers kind of building in the story that make the story stick with you. So I have here, real quick, I'm just going to go through these real quick, 5 stories that I handpicked. And the reason why I picked 5 for this hypothetical movie is because I don't see them needing to make any more movies in this series. If anything, if this proof of concept works, they can then branch off and do an anthology movie based around their Bronze Age hero characters, which they're way more known for, like the Blades and the Johnny Blaze Ghost Riders of the IP, or the Man-Things of the IP, right? They could branch into that, maybe call it Strange Tales or something that probably would be fitting, or they can branch out into kaiju monster stuff specifically, like the Kirby big monster stuff that was really popular because of Godzilla becoming a massive hit in the 1950s and the 60s. for kids in the cinemas. So, who knows? Sky's the limits, but this would be, I guess, their one shot at making a comic book love letter anthology movie. So I picked her 5 stories, and trust me, like I said earlier, the pool is so small. These are the only 5 stories, and I genuinely mean that. And I have something more interesting to play with DC in the follow-up. That's why I saved it for second. But Marvel stories are just a mess most of the time. And they're mostly forgettable. But these 5, without a doubt, are the best ones, in my opinion, that I think people would like to see. These are also my 5 personal favorites for basically that reason, is that these are worthy of being told outside of these pages here. So real quick to run them down, I'll also have pictures in the video so you can see what comic issue they come from. And I've organized them not necessarily in order I want to see them in this hypothetical movie or my favorites or anything. I just made a list of the ones that came to my head. So that being said, my first pick is actually the oldest story and the only Atomic Age story on this list. It came out in Adventures into Terror, ironically, in issue number 20, which I think might be the best issue, maybe next to Menace number 5 of Atomic Age Marvel Comics. And the story that released in this comic in March of 1953 is called Tommy Has a Teddy Bear. Now, the title sucks ass. If they're going to adapt this, they should shorten it to Tommy's Bear. And most people that I've seen review this story online think it's one of these silly, corny type of stories, which admittedly it is. But to me, when I first read this story, I think a few years ago, when I got into, I guess, trying to complete all the series I needed to do when I got into Adventures into Terror, and I read this, it reminded me a lot of Stephen King's famous short story that people have been wanting adapted in stuff like Creepshow for years and years, called Popsy. This is essentially Marvel's version of Popsy, but I also think that this story has historical significance because in horror anthology comics, it seems like every publisher from back then, including Charlton Comics, which I actually might make a part 3 just for Charlton, now that I'm thinking about it. I'll see when we get there. But it seems like every story that involved a teddy bear had similar tropes to this one, and I think this was the first one to do it. Right? This might be one of the first times in horror anthology comics outside of just a baby doll or a creepy like doll that looks like a human was turned into a monster of the story. And it's very simple. It's about a little boy who gets abducted by these 2 goons who are trying to hold the boy ransom. And he's abducted in his sleep with his teddy bear that he goes to bed with. And while the crooks have the boy that's asleep in the car, they notice that the teddy bear in the back seat has been moving around, and they wonder what's going on with that. And in the commotion of them freaking out about that, the little boy wakes up, and the crooks start to panic because the way they're driving erratically, it starts to catch the attention of the police, and the police start chasing them down, and they get on a high-speed chase, and they end up veering off this road. Where the boy is alarmed and they can't seem to find this teddy bear. And the crooks have come to the conclusion that since the boy has awakened and they have been seen, they have to possibly make a tough decision and take care of this young fella. And let's just say there's a hero in the midst that comes out of the woodwork and makes do in a pretty grisly fashion, pun intended, of these crooks. And once the police find this little boy, he seems a little shaken up, but he's not at all fazed about the violence he just witnessed in front of him. And it's kind of morbid and dark, but super schlocky and fun. So, yeah, of course, it's a story that involves a guardian angel archetype of, a little boy having that pet or toy that ends up saving the day for them. This is a trope that we've seen in horror comics throughout the years. This is no different here. I will say, while there's hardly any subtext, I think there's subtext that could be added onto the story to make it more creep show like, which I would prefer. And there's a lot of room to expand on the opening of the story, because the opening of the story just throws you right into the kid being abducted in his room. There could be build up in adding reason and motives to these crooks and why they are specifically targeting this young boy, and they can easily build onto maybe the mythos in the background of the teddy bear and trying to explain why it can do what it can do. And if it does that and it keeps the violence that was heavily implied in the panels, which for 1950s Marvel, it was off page mostly, but you do see like bloody, mutilated, cut off hands in some bushes, which is hardcore for them at the time. If they're able to pull off the gore there and just do it up over the top, and you get that like morbid ending that the story has, I think people would really like this one. So that's my first pick. My second pick happens to be a story that I feel like if you are a fan of horror anthology comics and you love Bronze Age comics, this seems to be a fan favorite story from Marvel of the time, and I actually would hold it up in high regard against anything that DC put out in the Bronze Age. It's a very good story. I seem to think that Stephen King and George Romero might have taken inspiration of this to write one of their iconic stories from the original Creepshow film called Something to Tide You Over. But that's just me, because this story does have a lot of similarities to it. It's not the first Water Revenant story ever, but it did come out in November of 1972. And from what I've experienced, this is one of the first stories that do it in this type of way that's similar to Creepshow. So there could be some credence here. I actually own the physical comic, and I pulled it out here. This comes from Volume 2 of Journey into Mystery, and it's issue number 3. And the story that's inside is called Revenge from the Rhine. Now, I have a really high-grade copy, so I have this in the top loader. This is one of my most cherished horror anthology comics ever. I just love this book. I can't tell you how many times I've read this issue just casually, but this story here is very much like Creepshow, very entrenched in traditional EC comics, which I think is the reason why I love it so much. It's like one of the only Marvel comic stories that I've ever read that pretty much could fit right in to the franchise. Now, because it's Marvel though, the ending kind of feels tame, sadly, but that's easily fixable. The story is about a World War I pilot from Germany who is getting up there in age, and he lives alone in this castle because he spent his whole life being loveless and being driven by valor in war, and that being like a career militaryman. And as he's drinking and he's overlooking his war treasures, he's overlooking this certain pendant that seemed to have escaped him. And it's always haunted his career. The one thing that he wanted the most, he just could never get. And we go into flashback into his attempts into getting this said medal for his collection. And we learn that during World War I, during a battle, they realized that the war was over, and while they were pretty much in mid-air battle, and they were telling each other to pull back fire. But for him, he didn't have his moment to shine in the war to earn his medal, so he went out of his way to shoot down an enemy plane, which, of course, kills the person in the plane, and their body ends up in the Rhine River, which is, I guess, in that part of the area of Europe where, like, France goes through Belgium and Germany and all that. But they're over in France. And because there were witnesses to what he did, he felt like this valor was being taken away from him because after he did that, he was expecting some recognition. He just didn't get it. So he goes right up to his cohorts who witnessed what he did, and he makes do of them in their own grisly situation off a ship into the Rhine River. And all these years later, once that happened and he never got that one medal that got away, as he's recollecting on that memory, since his castle is also on the Rhine River, he is visited by some patrons that want to pay him a visit. And let's just say the man is cornered, caught off guard by these visitors who essentially want him to suffer a fate probably worse than death. And while it's Marvel and it's kind of hokey, we see what happens to this pilot, and the ending implies that it ain't good, right? For this one, I mean, it's pretty much ready to go for an adaptation. It's more whole feeling than your average comic story. It is quite long. I think this is like an 8-pager, maybe even a 10-pager. So there's a lot more to chew on with the story. It's simple asshole comeuppance, but it also has some subtext about like stolen valor, and not in that way of like wearing military regalia and pretending to be a serviceman. It's not that. Stolen valor, what in the regards I'm referring to, is like trying to pretend like you did something great when it wasn't great at all, even if you're serving, right? And I do pick up on that message here, and yeah, it's quite poetic what happens to him. My only fix would be to like modernize it. The climax needs to be less weird and hokey, and they can fix that up pretty easily because these are water revenants that we're talking about here. And while I think the power and ability that's showcased in the climax is cool, they can easily go more violent with it and tie that into the climax, or maybe even change it up a little bit in the context of how the ending happens. I don't want to spoil it because I want you to go into these stories and read them, but yeah, this is just a fan favorite Bronze Age story, and I get why. It's one of my personal favorites too, and yeah, that's why it's on this list. Okay, so number 3. Now, this is the only one that I picked that came from those Marvel magazines I was talking about. This story gives Bourne magazines a run for their money. Yeah, this came out in November 1974, and it arguably came out in probably the best horror comic run that Marvel had at the time. For horror, which was Tales of the Zombie. If it wasn't Tomb of Dracula, it was this. Tales of the Zombie is a fantastic series that follows mainly the character of Simon Garth in each individual issue. However, back then, and even up to today, magazines were known if they had a leading character, they would have side stories to kind of fill out the magazine. And then you have these little one-shot stories that feel traditional anthology. And in issue number 9 of Tales of the Zombie, released in November 1974, there was a story in there that I think rivals Jennifer from Creepy issue number 63 from Warren, written by Bruce Jones, which a lot of people have said is the greatest Bronze Age horror story in comics ever. Which I have to agree, but this rivals that in terms of what the fuck? And the story is called Herbie the Liar Said It Wouldn't Hurt. This one is just, well, I'll explain it. It's pretty out there, right? It's about this leper, and he's deformed, all right. So he lives in, like, I guess, the deep south. He could have some birth defects, maybe from inbreeding. I don't know. It's very vague. But he looks like a leper that you would see in like a Bruce Jones comic. And within the first few panels, we find that he's with his brother cutting down some firewood from some trees. And in a disagreement, or I guess by accident, the hideous, deformed guy swings an axe and bludgeons his brother's face inward, and he dies, of course, from blunt force trauma, and it's very graphic and violent. And of course, um, he freaks out, and he doesn't know how to go about it, but he rationalizes that this event happens because his brother, who's named Herbie, um, did something wrong in terms of, like, getting one over on him, essentially. But he knows that his mom is also more scary to deal with than his brother ever was. So when he gets home, he tries to explain to his mom what happened to his brother, and his mom just berates him and says, "You always say these crazy things, and you're useless, and you're a piece of crap. I don't know why I have to live with you, blah, blah, blah." And she proceeds to take a cat of nine tails and whip him, like hardcore. So we get a sense that he's like abused by his mom, like legitimately in that way, emotionally and physically. And he's sent down to this dungeon, which ends up being this basement of this woodland house. And down in the basement, he sees the entity or the spirit of his brother, which is there to kind of coach him into thinking that the mom is actually the source of all the problems in her, our main character's life. And it would be easier to live alone and, be by himself than have any company of his mother. So through that coaching, the main character decides to confront his mom, and then we see in the climax what becomes of the main character's mother. But wouldn't you know, in a twist of fate, right? Because this is a shocking story, we do have a unexpected twist at the end that I guarantee you do not see coming the first time you read this story. And I think that for first-time viewers, if this got straight up just adapted as is onto screen, people would be shocked at the visual that the end of this comic story leaves. And I'll just leave it there. I don't even want to get into the context of it because I think you can pick up what I'm saying here. But yeah, this one would just be outright disturbing, if not controversial. I know in today's landscape, people are afraid of, coming out with something taboo or controversial like this because it depicts people a certain way with like mental illness or depression or maybe suicidal tendencies, or glorifying violence and glorifying abuse for the sake of a story. For people out there that take this stuff super seriously, and you want media to be for everyone, this is one of the stories that are pretty evidently not made for everyone. So I think you should understand that before you go into something like this. But it's horror, right? Horror is meant to kind of push the boundaries and make you feel a certain way. It doesn't always have to be, smiles, laughs, and rainbows when you think about horror. It can be shocking and perverse and just deplorable. This is easily the most dark Marvel story they have ever put out. And if things like Masters of Horror put out Jennifer, which I think is arguably more disturbing and fucked up when you think about what happens in that story than this ever was, I think Marvel can easily put this one out. It's more grounded in realism, but yeah, it's a bloody one. And it makes you think about stuff like abuse and the effects it has on people. So it has subtext to it. So yeah, that's my number 3. My number 4 actually goes to one of those modern comics I was talking about that came out in 2019. I guess consider this the science fiction representative of this hypothetical movie here. This easily is their best science fiction story compared to stories about just like going back in time and finding dinosaurs with ray guns and goofy crap like that. Like hokey science fiction shit from the 50s. This one is pretty freaking cool. It came out in that issue called Journey into Unknown Worlds, and it's called Bones of the Earth. Now, Bones of the Earth is pretty straightforward. It's about a team of scientists who have been notified that there was a anomaly from space that has crash landed onto Earth in the woods nearby, and they're there after a few days of initial contact from that satellite that has fallen to Earth. And when they arrive there, they find bones of animals strewn about, and they don't know how to feel about that. And when they go to investigate the bones themselves, they come into contact with a certain substance that, let's just say, when it gets onto you, it can torch your bones, and you start having horrific body mutilation and body horror to be had. And once it's kind of revealed that there's some sort of contagion and possible extraterrestrial life at play here, these researchers, of course, have to succumb to over-the-top violence amongst each other because of this outbreak. And it's revealed in kind of like a Deus Ex Machina kind of way that there's sentient creatures that come along with this that kind of show the researchers exactly what's going on. And there's a possible chance at containment where it doesn't have to affect everybody in the world. And because of this outbreak, when it gets down in numbers for these researchers, the last one left is really the only hope for humanity. And I don't want to give away any of the context because it's so interesting about how this outbreak is going about and maybe the malevolence of these aliens in question. But we find out by the end, perhaps, what the real fate of humanity is going to be, right? So, yeah, this one I think would be super fun to see, like, the body horror elements of. Obviously, it's highly rooted in stuff like John Carpenter's The Thing and maybe even Aliens to a degree. And some people could say that this is a derivative story, but for Marvel standards, this is as good as you're going to get to a science fiction story in horror. And to be honest, the body horror in this would look fantastic, especially if they had like actual practical effects. And some of these gore scenes, especially when you get into like the fights and the initial outbreak of it all, would be spectacular. It would be absolutely spectacular, and I would love to see it. So, yeah, I'm just going to keep that one short. Yeah, that's why that one's on the list. And my last one, number 5 here, actually goes to a Twilight Zone feeling one. So people might be like, oh, man, here we go with this. But this, by far, is the best Twilight Zone feeling story. And ironically, it did not come out in the 50s. It came out in the 70s. More specifically, May 1970 here. So, like, very early Bronze Age Marvel. And it's from a title known as Chamber of Darkness, which essentially kind of like other tales from the Bronze Age that initially started out in series like Journey into Mystery Volume 2. You had a batch in the earlier issues where they would do original stories and slowly but surely start mixing in reprint stories. Chamber of Darkness is well known to be like a big reprint title. So having an original story in there is rare. But that's the title of this the book it came out in, and it was from issue number 6. And the story is called Put Another Nickel In. So this one has a lot of room to expand on. I think it probably has the most potential to be like a Black Mirror-esque story than anything else that Marvel has. And when I say that, I mean that as a compliment, because the concept is about this this robber who just got done committing a murder, is on the run from the police, and very early on he finds himself inside of this fun house. And this fun house is very colorful. There's a bunch of arcade games. There's some weird paintings. There's like optical illusion stuff going on. And the man makes his way into the back of this funhouse arcade of sorts to hide out from the police. And to, I guess by the time he stumbles across this Nickelodeon machine that says it can show you the past and the future. And the guy's like, I think I need to see my future because maybe, just maybe, it can show me how to avoid the cops, or maybe if I see myself get a bad future, I can try to avoid it. So he pops a nickel into the machine, but instead of showing him the future so he can get out scot-free, it shows him the past. And we as the audience get to see right before he entered the funhouse, and the murder involved that took place. And it turns out that this robber was there to essentially extort and rob this famous scientist of the area that is well respected and liked by his peers and community. And because of this altercation, the scientist lost his life, or the inventor lost his life. And that commotion and people hearing the gunshots and the screaming caught the attention of the police. And when the guy was escaping, the police happened to notice him, and now we've come full circle. Well, once the man is done seeing the past shown to him in that way, he's taken aback, and he's actually kind of scared, because he's like, wow, I was not expecting that to happen. Like, like, what kind of trickery is this, right? And then the police, of course, start shooting at him because they find him with the Nickelodeon machine. And since he doesn't know what's going to happen in the future, he makes a break for it and tries to jump out a window. But fortunately, things don't pan out as expected, right? And once we find out what happens in the aftermath of that, there's a big old recontextualization moment about the Nickelodeon machine and how it ties to the other events of the story, and I'll just leave it at that. And I was like, wow, that was actually very clever writing. Like, for Marvel standards, this has to be one of the more clever stories that they've put out in this subgenre over the years. And that's why it's always stuck with me as like one of my favorite ones, because of that ending. Now, in terms of like it making like a good movie segment, of course, this kind of shows you that Marvel was doing Twilight Zone type of stories. And I think because of that setup, in order to, I guess, modernize it, I think people would want more exploration into the main character himself, because he is, I guess, the villain of the story. You'd probably want to get into more of their motives of why they're doing what they're doing. And especially in terms of like the Nickelodeon machine showing the past element, that's the part of the story I think it could really expand on. And then pretty much just keep the climax in the ending and you're good to go, right? So, yeah, that's my last pick there. And yeah, that's basically all I got, because I was thinking on maybe some honorable mentions to share too, but really those 5 stories, I think, to capture what it's like to be a Marvel comic the best, especially when it was actually putting out new content of the matter. I mean, you had an example of Twilight Zone in there. You had an example of just shocking stuff that could have been rivals to Warren magazine stuff they were putting out at the time. You had science fiction in there that Marvel was known for. You had your typical EC comic / creep show appeal flair in there. Then you had the silly stuff that's kind of corny and campy but fun, right? All in one blender. And having a showcase of these 5 stories in one movie will pay respect to that age that Marvel no longer cares about today in their comics, and I guess their filmography at large. But this video essentially is to be like, if they were to make a horror anthology movie, this is what it could look like. And honestly, these stories that I shared probably are the only picks that should be on the table, unless they randomly decide to pull out a story title out of the hat and they're like, all right, decent concept, we're going to in-name only it. Unless they're doing that and they just want to disregard the whole thing, that's fine. If not, these have to be it. Because I'm telling you, no other story, I think, would be able to top what I picked here. And trust me, I've read them all. So yeah, that concludes part 1 of the Marvel side of things. And now we're going to go into part 2 in the next video, where we pick back up the question of why aren't, or why hasn't Marvel and DC made horror anthology movies, given their past with horror anthology comic stories? And we'll pick up that question with DC and possibly titling the movie and picking out stories for it. So, until next time, take care. And let me know down in the comment section, okay, if you really do believe that there are better Marvel horror anthology comic stories to add to a hypothetical movie, put it down in the comment section. And also, if you had to pick a title from those old titles, which one would you go with? Till next time, take care.